60 years ago, this was one of the most armed areas of the parish of Mawnan. Around it was barbed wire about 15 feet high. The road coming in had armed guards on it. Where I'm standing is the remnants of the old battery observation post, and below me are the gun floors, 2 of them, with French 75 guns mounted on them. The reason why this was placed here was to give cover on this dead water we see between Rosemallion Head and Nair Point. The bay was covered by Pendennis. There was a big gun emplacements there, but any ship passing inside the cover of Rosemallion Head could not be hit by them. This video will be dedicated to those that served here in Mawnan Home Guard and Burok. Also to the villagers who suffered through the war years, and for those who never returned. And it wasn't until the end of the war that we realised how badly missed they were. It was that when everything went back to normal and they went there, and that's when they were missed mostly by all of us.
You know, a German cruiser, the Sherwood Austin, she came into Falmouth, and of course, being nice Cornish people, they all knew there was going to be trouble. They said, oh, we'll invite them everywhere and play football against them, and, you know, whatever there was. They came out to Mawnan. Well, by now, I was playing football for Mawnan. They were smart. They were mostly cadets, really fit boys, and they knew how to play football, whereas we would have been better playing rugby, not soccer. But anyway, it went on, and I don't know how we got on. We might have beaten them 2-1, I am not sure. But I know one come into me, oh, I shoved my shoulder into him. Well, the next day, the Sunday, we were invited out to the boat, and of course I went out there, and the sailor came up to me. Yeah, opened his mouth, and all the inside of his mouth was all torn. God, I thought, well, poor old boy. That was a bit of bad. My boss up here, and like a lot of the local big houses, they invited the officers and all that out and gave them a good welcome in 38. But in 39, when they came, they were all snubbed. It was a different picture altogether, because every cadet had a camera. You knew afterwards what they was here for, really, didn't you? To take photos and all that. And of course, that was the first ship to bomb Danzig.
I can well remember I was in the village square here in Mawnan Smith on a bicycle, and my uncle opened his little cottage window, across which the cottage is still there, and he said, listen to this, you know, and it was Mr. Neville Chamberlain about to make his famous speech.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Then nothing much happened then, really. I think there were the odd false alarm for air raids in places, but not down here, in the big cities, I think. And then things rolled on until the next summer, I guess, when things started warming up.
I was sitting on the lawn on a lovely sunny day, and the windows in the house was open. My father had the radio on, and I heard the announcement of the start of the war, which was a bit upsetting. Well, I thought there was going to be the end of the world then, but of course life just went on.
He used to work up the road here, Penmorn, gardening, and he was a real gentleman, the boss was. So he came out to me one day there, and he said, "Freddie, you haven't had any holiday yet. What about your holiday?" Well, I said, "To be honest, I'm going away in August for a month's camp this year instead of a fortnight's camp." So I said, I should be away quite a while, so I won't take a holiday. Of course, I went home and the papers was looking worse and worse, so I went to work the Monday morning and I said, "Look, I think I better have a week's holiday. I don't like the look of things." "Oh, that's all right." So of course home, of course natural enough that time of the year, then on the beach, and I was down there swimming. Well, the dock shooter used to go about 5 o'clock in those days. So I was then coming out of the water when the Ooter went. And a chap came down to me here, he said, "Your crowd's being called up." I thought, "Oh my God, here we go." Of course, previous time I didn't mind. So I went home, cycled home. Father was working for a farmer after tea, so he wasn't home. Mother had gone down to buy a couple shirts because I thought the war was coming on. And next thing, army lorry pulls up outside and come on I went. So we went back into Falmouth because I was in the RE, so the barracks is pulled down now. And up at the recreation ground, I saw the Budok bus, so I said, "Here, hang on a minute." So I boarded the bus and Mother was in the back, so I said, "Look, Mother, I'm called up. I gotta go." Oh, and tears fly, that's natural enough. Then I heard after, another lady helped her out. She said, "You might never see him again."
First I knew we were in church in Falmouth, the Catholic church in Falmouth, and the priest then in charge came and announced that we were at war with Germany. Well, the first thing of course was to Mass continued, and when we went home all kinds of orders came from government departments of all sorts, and all these orders my father carried out absolutely to the letter because he was that sort of a person. And the first thing of all was to get an effective blackout. This was not easily done because we had only recently, in the last 12 months, opened Nansidwell as a hotel. Previously it had been a private house from the time it was built at the turn of the century. A lovely old building, but because of that, extremely difficult to make sure that every area was blacked out. But he did.
We're gonna hang out the washing on the Siegfried line. Have you any dirty washing, mother dear? We're gonna hang out the washing on the Siegfried line, 'cause the washing day is here.
The first bombs, or not really bombs, but mines, two of them descended on Mawnan Smith, and I think it was about May the 9th, 1941. I'm still at the grammar school, and it was a lovely moonlight night again, and these things came down, and the first thing I know was the bed is covered in glass, window panes are broken, and the front and back door were off their hinges, few slates off the roof, and my father tearing off out. He said, "Don't you come, boy." He said, "You stay there." And he went off, and our house turned out to be about a couple 100 yards under the hill from where one of the mines went off. And he went up the road and came back later on to say, "It's hit poor old Cutter's house." He said, "Mr. and Mrs. Cutter have gone." And they found them on a bed about 50 yards away in a ditch. And but their bungalow had been blown to smithereens, and the Cutters were, they seemed to be, he was a real chap who got into everything in the village. He was one of the mainstays of the bowling club. He was always running things in the village hall, and he was a really, I think he was a gardener in one of the estates. Real nice bloke, and they've gone, and next morning we go up and looked at and the parachute was still hanging from a tree. at the bottom of Cowinian Lane. And this has destroyed most of the, blown out most of the houses around there. A number of cottages, and my uncle's house had been gutted from one end to the other, although he wasn't living there. Someone else was. But these people seemed to be the only ones killed, and no one else was really much injured. 2 of the Latymer evacuees were pulled out of a house called Lowenter at Grove Hill, because that house was in complete mess because the second mine had come in, had fallen between the house and one owned by Gundry the farmer, and they were completely destroyed. But no one was hurt. One of the Home Guard went to rescue them, and dear old Mr. Beck and Mrs. Beck said as they ploughed their way through the front door, "Be careful, you'll hurt the door." And the whole house is down around them, you know.
I remember being woken, you know, with this tremendous explosion it was, and well, our cottage was very old, and sort of hearing the plastering all rattling down onto the ceiling boards, and we got up and went downstairs, and one thing I do remember, our cottage, it had an enormous lock and key in the door. It was like a great big jailer's key to open the door, and the blast had sort of blown the door off the lock, and the lock was still in the door frame, and the door was swinging open.
But all of a sudden there was a sort of swooshing noise. And we thought, oh my God, this is terrible. I'm right outside the Red Lion now in the village square. And with a chap, William Rickard, who's also well known in the village, and 1 or 2 other locals. And we just went flat on our face in the road. And this bomb fell just behind the village hall. But of course we rushed over there. You know, being in the village, we were there in about half a minute. And there was this huge crater. And down in the crater, the first thing we got hold of was a piece of red hot shrapnel, which burnt my fingers, and then a rabbit, a dead rabbit, which I promptly brought home with me. And by this time, half the village are down there because you know, there didn't seem to be any harm. And others are looking. He must have. He dropped more than 1 bomb, sure, you know. And then they suddenly found the fin of one sticking out of the ground a bit further along, about 50 yards along. So within a few seconds, no one to be seen. Everyone had gone. And that was the first time I met up with the old superintendent I was to work for later. On a Saturday morning, he came out with a bomb disposal squad, because everyone had been kept away from there by now. And the bomb disposal squad had come out to get rid of this bomb. And the first thing he said to a boy called Ivan Spike and myself is, "Where's this bomb, boys? Take me down to the bomb." So we went down with the army boys and the superintendent of police, and I said, "It's over there." You know, he said, "Come on, come and have a look." And he had us stood on top of the damn thing virtually. Anyway, they got this bomb out, and I mean, I think they empty out they set off the detonators or something, or they do something with it, and they sort of take the guts of it out, and then the shell is taken away in a huge. Well, all I know is the shell virtually filled the lorry. It was a huge thing.
That was when the bombs dropped down in the slips, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. And opposite side of the road to us, there was well, it was a sort of garage that belonged to the Coxclows, with a room, a small room up over, and the Boy Scouts used to meet there. And the Scouts had a meeting that night, and my brother was up at the Scout meeting. And of course these bombs came down, and there was these explosions. We heard the bombs coming down, and Mother and I were in the kitchen, and my grandmother sitting in the chair by the fire. And we heard the bombs coming down, and Mother and I shot under the kitchen table, and our cat shot under the chest of drawers. And my grandmother, being a bit deaf, she hadn't heard anything, you see. And I remember her peering down at us and saying, "What are you doing down there?" You know, very surprised.
April morning, about 9 o'clock, out of this bay, there was mist on the water, came 3 aircraft, came hurtling out, over the top where we were standing, up the river. They fired their cannon fire at, were just near Trebah beach. They dropped a bomb, and that which exploded. Then they dropped another, and that bounced over the guardship of the river, the Nazarene. It bounced, it landed, it bounced over her, and it exploded and blew her flat on her side. And she righted herself, and the 2 men who were on board were perfectly all right. Nobody had fired a gun, and they were gone, disappeared. And the reason for it all was that they were Focke-Wulf 190s, just like a Spitfire.
At the time, I think they were driving the piles for the landing pier for D-Day off Trebah. And I just happened to be looking out to sea, and I saw this aircraft coming. It was a Focke-Wulf 190, I knew what it was. Low, very low indeed. And it came straight up to Helford, and the little Nazarene that used to anchor opposite the ferryboat inn during the day was there, and I saw this aircraft drop his bomb, and it actually skipped over the Nazarene and went off the other side. I can see the fellow with the Lewis gun on the front. He didn't even get time to fire it, and this thing went off. And my first thought was down over the fields into my boat, see if there any fish come up, but I was too quick. Didn't find any. Other people did later.
I can remember seeing 2 or 3 bombs, and the Nazarene, which was a patrol boat that used to go out into Falmouth Bay, was absolutely rocking when I ran down the garden path to have a look to see what was going on. And eventually the crew from the Nazarene came and asked us did we have any crockery, because all their crockery had been broken on the Nazarene.
It was on June the 17th in 1940 when 110 evacuees came to Mawnan from Latymer School in Edmonton in London and arrived here on a lovely day and were taken into the village hall. They had just a little bit of luggage with them. They had labels, they had their gas masks, and they'd come to a village, as they said later, somewhere in England, not really sure where it was. There were several village families here who were ready to welcome them, and in fact Mawnan really did open their arms and hearts to these evacuees. My father was Mr. Wilfred Pascoe, who lived next door in Dracaena Bungalow, and he, at the beginning of the war, was chief ARP warden for the village and carried on with that until the end of the war. But when the evacuees were coming to Mawnan, he was to be the billeting officer. My mother was one of the teachers that was evacuated, one of the 7 teachers that came down with Latymer School, and she was a Miss Brown, and she taught science, and she also was responsible for quite a lot of the music with the children. And they organised concerts for the villagers, concerts for themselves, and I know my mother organised lots and lots of walks all around the area, which she always told me were very difficult because of course all the signposts had been taken down, so they had to rely on maps and instinct. My mother was here for the 2 years of the war, and she was billeted with a Mrs. Tallock who lived in Carlidnock Road. Now, during that time, of course, my mother got to know my father very well, And at the end of the time when the evacuees went back to Latymer, my mother stayed on. I think she found that the Cornish climate and other things suited her a lot better. She went to teach at Helston Grammar School, and in 1944, on December the 23rd, married my father at St Justin Roseland Church. So Latymer and Mawnan were linked there, and then I was born on May the 8th in 1946.
I was helping with them finding homes to go to, and it was left with 4. I knew that we were supposed to have 2 and Trevorgan Big House was supposed to have 2, but these 4 didn't want to be split. That's why they were still together. A boy and his 2 sisters, younger sisters, who he was told to look after, and a friend of his, and they had a pact that they weren't going to be separated. So, and in desperation, I said, "Oh, you better come home with me, and we'll sort it out in the morning." What my mother must have thought when I arrived home with 4 children, don't know. And it ended up that because the little girl, she was only 7 and she was crying, and she couldn't see a big house at the end of the drive. She wasn't going to leave her brother. So my sister and I got turfed out to the big house, and my mother had the 4 children, and she kept them, yes.
It was a very great honour for me in 2000, in the year 2000, on June the 17th, to be asked to unveil the plaque to commemorate the Latymer evacuation in the hall. And it was really wonderful to meet all the evacuees who had known my mother so well and were able to talk about all the things that they did when they were here. And in my part, I was able to show them a photograph that had been taken of them in 1942, just here outside these railings. And they had all signed their names on the back, and that was one that they hadn't actually seen before.
During the war, meat was very short, and some farmers used to kill a bullock or a pig, and one of my farmer friends, he had another farm a few miles away, and he was killing a cow there one day, and the police came, and he asked me to ride across country to get up there to cover it up with hay and straw before they got there. Eventually he did get caught, and he was put into court in Falmouth, and he had a solicitor representing him, and he said that he thought he was going down, but anyway he said, "Leave it to me." And when he was at the court, they asked him all different types of questions, and he said, "I'm very sorry, but I was not educated, I can't understand what you're saying of." So he brought the solicitors down to his level, and he actually won the case.
It was always a bit of a worry with Mother what she was going to give them to eat, because we were on rations, you know. It was always a problem. What am I going to feed people on? And especially as they were Jewish, and you know, it was made it a little bit more difficult what she could give them. Anyway, on this occasion, Mother managed to get hold of a rabbit, and she thought she would prepare this rabbit for their evening meal. And Mrs. Rabin never said anything to her, and Mother didn't realise it, because Mr. Rabin, he was very particular, and he wouldn't actually, he didn't eat rabbit, you know. And Mrs. Rabin, she didn't mind, she would eat anything. So she never said a word to Mother. She came out in the kitchen and saw Mother preparing this. And she said, "Is that for our meal this evening?" And Mother said, "Well, yes it is." She said, "I'm going to stuff it and roast it." So anyway, the meal was duly served, and Mr. Rabin ate the rabbit, and afterwards he said, "Well, that was very nice." He said, "What sort of meat was it, you see?" And Mrs. Rabin, before Mother could say a word, she said, "Oh, it was chicken, you see." So he thought for a moment and he said, well, he said, "It's got very funny bones if it's a chicken." So Mrs. Rabin said, "Of course it's got funny bones. It's a Cornish chicken," she said.
There were guns out on the left-hand side, the mouth of the Helford, just below Mawnan Church. There were guns there. And I remember later on, when the Americans were there were guns. There was a big gun just in front of our house on Bar Road. And there were others on all the promontories all the way up the Helford, you know, all down the Helford here. It's a boom across the Helford with a small gap in the middle. Which was not guarded by day, but by night there was a little boat called the Nazarene that used to go out there and anchor by the boom entrance.
It had, I suppose it was about 4 inches diameter, and it was sort of kapok, sort of white cottony stuff, kapok, and on the ends there were sort of little, well, rubber balls really, and that's all sewn in, sealed in, I suppose, and that used to float very well, and they had, I suppose, bigger buoys, you know, going to the, anchored to the bottom. Because after the war, we used to cut these things open to get the balls out, and the kapok.
You couldn't get rubber balls.
You couldn't get rubber balls, no.
People used the kapok for stuffing cushions.
Yes, it's quite good stuff it was.
Nothing was wasted in those days. No.
They put in pipes along Grebe Beach, which were supplied by oil from tanks in the wood above. And the idea was to set these alight should anybody decide to try and invade. As the war went on, the Americans came in. Of course, we had a Beaufort's gun out in the field and also a searchlight near the cottage, and that was basically to build up to D-Day.
This was the days of the LDV, the Local Defence Volunteers, which was what Home Guard were initially called. How they came to be called Home Guard, I'm not too sure. I don't think anybody is. I think it was a remark from Churchill once, referring to our Home Guard, and then the name stuck. But they needed somewhere down along the shore in which they could have a little place where they could have a cup of tea and keep some of their gear. And we had the deck house of HMS Lion down on Bream Cove. So he converted this for them, put in a concrete floor, and organised it with some oil lamps. But it was a little spot that they could go to and have a little bit of rest and get out of the rain when it was raining and keep some of their gear. The Naval College, the Dutch Naval College, was at Ennis, nearby Penryn. And many of them used to come and stay and have meals at Nancypole through the war. And one of them wandered down to the beach on his own, and because he was Dutch, as far as the Home Guard were concerned, he must be German. So, as there were only 2 of them down there, they kept him there all night, because they dare not let one go back up to the hotel, which is what he wanted them to do, to check that he was a Dutchman, and certainly wasn't a 5th column or a German parachutist.
I mean, the Home Guard would be seen prowling around the village and doing all sorts of crazy things, and they became quite smart. When we started, I mean, well, by the time I got in, we had proper uniforms, and you're issued with a Royal Enfield rifle. So I had one, and my dad had one as well. So we have 2 guns in the house, and they were changed later on for Sten guns. So we had Sten guns. We also had stirrup pumps and a bucket for in case any incendiaries were dropped.
I think then joining the Home Guard was compulsory. I was in the reserved occupation that is my work, and therefore you were compelled to join the Home Guard. And I used to cycle to Mawnan, and we would be out one evening a week. Possibly it'd be 2 evenings, one for drilling or gas or lectures. But the night you were on duty, you would be out from about 10 until 12 making contact with Falmouth Home Guard, which is on the coastal walk, and we walked around the coast down towards Nansudgel and down Brain Beach. And then after that you would go back, after about 2 hours out, you would go back and you'd go and sleep in the bank on a straw mattress. And then about 7 o'clock you would get up and cycle home and go to work. And no complaints in those days. I can honestly say that no one ever complained.
One of the favourite places for the Home Guard was to guard the Toll Point at the mouth of the Helford. And by this time a couple of huts had been built by the church, in the field by the church. And I can remember regular troops being in there for a time. And I can remember them giving a band concert one lovely sunny afternoon. And when the war seemed miles away, I think it was the Oxford and Buckinghamshire Regiment, I think, or Oxford and Beds. And they were quite smart local, troops brought into. But they were moved out in a short time, and the Home Guard more or less took over from them. So every night the Home Guard have got a crowd on duty in the hut up, in these 2 huts. So we would sleep in the huts. And I think we were on duty from dark till, dusk till dawn. And we would do 2 hours on and 4 hours off. And of course, being youngsters, we forgot about sleeping. And so we were more tired out next morning than the old boys. And we had to walk from these huts right down from Mawnan Church to the Tull in the pitch dark. And there's a little pit, sort of hut we stood into with a couple of slits out of it. And one night down there they said, be very careful tonight because we think you may get attacked, a mock attack, And it was a lovely moonlight night, and you could virtually hear people talking across the Helford River. And I'm there with an old boy called, Albert Peters, I think. He'd been the butler at Boslow House. I think his nickname was 90 or Quiff. Everyone had nicknames in the village. And he was years older than me, but he kept talking. And the next moment, we're both pinned to the floor. And the commandos had got us. And I remember them saying, if this was a real war, you'd be both dead now.
I became a messenger for the Home Guard, and my introduction was being taken to a little bungalow. As you come out of Mawnan Smith, the little bungalow's on the right. And my instructor was one Charlie Mann. People in Mawnan will remember Charlie Mann because he had a big collection. Charlie Mann was there to instruct me on the big Vickers machine gun. And this little front room of this bungalow, you could just swing this Vickers round. It was just about big enough. And I learned how to strip it down, the rear sear release lever and the rear sear and goodness knows what. You had to learn to strip it all down and put it back with your eyes folded, with your blindfolded. That was my first experience of that. And then I was employed as a messenger running between various Home Guard units because they used to have exercises where the commandos would come across the river in their little boats and make their way to Falmouth. I believe on one occasion they hijacked a train at the halt just before Falmouth and drove it into Falmouth docks, and they were in the docks before anybody realised they were there.
My father was part of the Observer Corps. He was called Bertram Richards. What my father did was a very, very necessary part of the home defence. It was a very difficult time for him as a young married man to have to be farming by day, and farming then was very difficult because it was all horses and horse-propelled machinery. And then at night he had to walk out to the observer corps and do his several hours plotting the planes in and out of the triangle of this area. It was very important, and they were responsible to Truro, and if they got a type of plane wrong, they were in quite serious trouble.
So when France fell, we were left almost completely ignorant about what was going on within France. We had to start from scratch. The Navy was charged with the responsibility of setting up really what was a ferry service to and fro from France to England and vice versa, carrying agents and radio operators and the whole spy network, ferrying them to and fro.
You felt you were situated in an area where there was something going on, but you didn't know what the something was.
No.
Like my father, working there most of the war, never ever said one word of what he actually did when he went off to work every day.
They were very secretive. You never knew what they were doing. They would go to sea in the morning, and you would have seen them the night before, but you didn't know they were going to sea the next day. And they went across to France, taking people and picking up agents. And there was one, the engineer, she was machine gunned on the way home. And he was unfortunately shot, and he's now buried over in the Scilly Isles.
Yes, I've seen the
And I
grave.
visit his grave to put a poppy wreath on most years.
Well, we've since learned that their main object was exchanging agents from France, bringing them home, collecting them. I believe the V2 rocket plans were brought back through the river, and I believe Howard Rendell was responsible for that. We think that's what he got his decoration for, but he never ever spoke of it, refused to speak of it. And they also brought back rescued crewmen who'd escaped, air crew. And I believe, I think I'm right, Riddifan was a debriefing house.
So when the gunboat left Falmouth, we used to join, we used to go along, inevitably we had to go past Helford River, and a launch used to come out from there, from the SOE base, with the stores and any agents who were going to France, and transfer them to us. And the reverse would happen when we came home. Any agents we'd brought back would go there. And then they would be, give them a bath and clean clothes and a meal, and put up for the night if necessary. And then they would be taken up to London and debriefed there. And that was the reception procedure for anybody coming home.
The garage was built. It was built in 1936, and Father decided to set up a motorcycle garage, mostly, a lot of agricultural work, and it continued until the war. And then during the war, the military took the garage over to store a lot of brand new motorcycles which had to be taken down to Helford Passage and loaded onto the boats for D-Day. But that's the earliest time I can remember as the new motorcycles. There was about 300 to 400 bikes there, and the bikes was father had to prepare them and get them ready, fill them up with fuel, and make sure all of them worked properly, and then they were taken away by the Americans, not the British. The Americans took them away. During the war, the entertainment was a problem. People couldn't travel and because of the blackouts and things, but father decided if he could get us some films, he would show some films to the locals, which he did. And anyhow, there were quite a few used to come up, and we used to put benches or planks across the oil drums, and people used to sit down just like the Odeon films. And one of the things he used to insist on was the films being paid for. So he used to charge people to start off with, and once the money was gathered into pay for the films, he would stop the charging, and then people could come in free. Of course, one or two locals who didn't have a lot of money certainly got caught on to that pretty quick. So they used to come in just as the film started, and then they used to come in without paying. So they used to have a very good evening. My mother had a little bit to do during the war. One of the things she used to do was make ice cream. And the only way she could make ice cream, because of the rationing, we didn't have any loads of custard and things like that. But the Americans used to come into the garage, and they used to say to father, "Do you want any custard to make ice cream, proper ice cream custard?" So father said, "Oh yeah, we can, somebody can eat it." So we made up an ice cream churn, which I used to turn. I remember turning it as a child in ice to form the ice cream. And mother used to sell ice cream during the war and just after the war. And all the custard came from the Americans.
My father was born across the Treath, which is over there, the middle one of those three, and stayed there until he was 3 years old. Then he moved down to Golden Gear, which is the building right opposite the ferry boat. Father then served his time as a mason with his uncle at Monacan. Then came across the river in the evenings for Pint of Beer, and that's where he met up with mother. Well, mother left school and came down here to work in about 1937. Of course, when you're younger, you don't listen to all these dates, but as you grow older, they do mean more. Mother came down here with Commander and Mrs. Doughton, and enjoyed every moment of it with other local people. She always remembered one big thing in her life was waiting table and looking after General Montgomery, who turned up here for a short while. And she said he was a very prim, small man, but all he had in his bedroom was a Bible.
During the war years, the ferry boat inn was a very popular destination and attracted visitors from many walks of life. Mandarins from the civil service, millionaires, and members of the royal family, or from the fringes of the royal family. And it was also very popular with personnel from the SIS and SOE bases nearby, who came to the newly built Riverside pub. The Budot Veen remained open throughout the war years. At the time it was owned by Harry Parkinson. Although alcohol was rationed, he'd managed to purchase the entire alcohol stock from the Palace Hotel in Torquay, and so the hotel managed to keep going pretty well. It was well used by members of the armed services, and one day it could be pretty quiet, and the next day it could be absolutely packed with members of the Royal Navy who'd come off their ships in Falmouth. Just prior to D-Day, the whole of West Cornwall was effectively cordoned off as preparations were made, and the hotel therefore was not allowed to have residents, but effectively became a glorified club restaurant for members of the armed forces. Indeed, I understand that the senior officers tried to make it exclusive to themselves, but failed miserably to keep the lower ranks out of the hotel. But there would be regular dances on a Saturday night, and it became a very popular place for particularly the Americans to bring some of the local girls out for a night out at the Budot on a Saturday.
Funnily enough, there was no rationing of hotel meals. There was rationing for people who were staying in hotels if they were there for more than 72 hours. We had a huge Victorian and very well established kitchen garden, and this was pressed to its absolute fullest, and in addition to that a nearby field he ploughed up, and that was growing vegetables as well, mainly things like beans, which were salted in huge great glass jars, because prior to the war we had actually made all our own electricity, and the glass jars were where the batteries had been, and they were absolutely ideal for laying down large numbers of beans and salting them. The other thing that he used, of course, were a large number of Kilner jars, plums and things of this nature we used to get when they were in season, and the cellars, the whole of the underground of the hotel, which had huge great cellars, was crammed back full with all the things that he was bottling.
The tank transporter soon existed with 30 transporters, 30 working transporters, and every section of 5 vehicles was in charge of a corporal, and he was on a motorcycle, as was the sergeant, and they used to go and lay the routes out, and they would stop all the traffic coming towards us, because we occupied a lot of road, because in those days we used to travel 100 yards apart. And so, you know, it doesn't take much to work that out at 3,000 yards, you know. We knew them as Valentine Donald Ducks, and they were an amazing piece of equipment, really. They had hydraulically operated canvas sides, and they had a screw, and the tank in fact became the keel. I've never drove one of those, and I didn't know quite how they performed, but I think they performed quite well in a calm sea. Unfortunately, at D-Day they didn't have a calm sea, but they were. The idea was they would assist with the landing and also with the crossing of the Rhine. They were meant to be very secret, because we didn't want the Germans naturally to know that we had tanks which could wade ashore like that. And so they had to be completely sheeted and away from the public gaze, under armed guard all the time.
Well, we saw tanks coming through on these big tank transporters, which were sort of huge lorries with these low loaders pulled by these sort of Scamel type, which were these big tractor type. And they were sort of pulled along about 10-15 mile an hour, I think. If you're on your bike, you could more or less keep up with them or catch hold. And they didn't like you doing that, but being a whole lot of kids, we did.
Oh, one morning we had to right on D-Day, we weren't allowed to cross Le Manva Forecross because they were all going down to Trebah, and you weren't allowed to break the convoy, buses or cars, and we had to leave Constantine 5 in the morning, go to Helston, then to Hale, or Camborne, not Hale, Camborne, and then to down into Penryn and come in that way. around Redruth and come in around and down into Falmouth that way. That's how we had to go to work.
We'd gone to bed, my brother and I, and Mother called us to come and have a look, and look out of the window, which was sort of quite amazing in itself after we'd gone to bed. And because the bedroom window overlooked the road, and all these sort of tanks and army lorries were passing by up the road. It was dark, but it was sort of just light enough to see. And I think they just had a little glimmer of a tail light on the back, and they were following closely one behind the other. And I remember my mother saying, you know, I think you should see this because you'll never see anything like this again. And then she said, I think the invasion must be starting, you know. I think she sort of felt it was a special moment, really.
We got into Trebah and we were stationed under the trees at Trebah. The Yanks were all dressed up in their best suits and we were there. And we used to get victual with them. And the Yanks then got their landing barges down on the Hards down there. And we used to help out. And now we were only a small detachment of Marines, you see, because we were all over the place. So they said, well, now we're off now. So that was D-Day, but the Yanks all piled into these landing barges, and there wasn't any room for us, thank goodness.
Came over on the Queen Elizabeth. I landed in Gorick, Scotland, and from there I travelled down to Tidworth Barracks, where I was stationed, and then from there I moved down to Penzance and out to Land's End, where I was stationed before we moved back to Penzance to leave for D-Day from Trebah Garden. We used to go out quite often from Land's End and take the LCIs out into the water, and everybody thought it was going to be D-Day. And everybody got seasick, and we'd come back to shore again. Then a week later, we'd go out and do the same thing. And this is D-Day. And they kept doing this to back and forth. And we finally come back, and then we moved to Penzance, and from there we took to France. First time I moved in with Mrs. Don Michael, 11 Harborview Crescent, Penzance. Her husband was a home guard. He was in a home guard. He was 40 years old. So he used to tell me, he's too old to go in. So the first night there, he said to me, Don, how can you come? You're not going out with your blokes to have a drink. I didn't say anything. He said, I know you're short of money. And he loaned me £1. I never forgot that. In those days, what £1 was worth. So every time we drew a KP, the kitchen, I'd bring him eggs and bread and everything. And my friend Jimmy would put it in our fatigues and bring them home, the eggs and whatever we could bring. They were short of.
Well, there was activity across what we would term across the water, over Trebah side. There's a field which looks across at Bazaine, and we could see a lot of activity there with concrete mixers, etc., road diggers, and they were bringing a road down across the field right down to Trebah Beach, being laid with concrete. Of course, we didn't know what it was, never had a clue what it was. And then we saw the beach completely laid with concrete. And well, that was that. We didn't take a lot of notice. There was the usual wartime activities going on, and And then one night in particular, I went out the back door for something, I don't know what, and I said to Father, I can hear a lot of engine noises somewhere. So he came out and I had a look, and he said, well, they're coming across from that side somewhere. So we was only about 2 fields away from where we could look across. So we went and had a look, and we could see all these lights just working their way down across this concrete road right down to Trebah Beach. And the bay was absolutely full of loading boats, loading boats. And we watched them for a long, long time. And then, we went home eventually, and the landing craft were still there, being loaded. And then in the morning, I got up early. I thought, I'll go down and have a look now. So I went down and had a look, and everything was completely still, as if nothing had ever happened. Amazing it was. absolutely.
I've left home to go to my work, and suddenly the whole road is just, with soldiers lying back in the hedges. When I came home late afternoon, they were gone. So it was just, I obviously knew that something possibly was about to happen, but it was just purely a guess. But it was very emotional. Not one soldier spoke, and it makes me emotional now.
Yeah.
In the small hours of this morning, May the 7th, 1945, I saw the formal acknowledgement by Germany's present leaders, military leaders, of their country's complete and utter defeat by land, in the air and at sea. The final act, General Jodel's signed admission of unconditional surrender, had little or nothing outwardly dramatic about it. The whole ceremony, in fact, was carried out on a cold and businesslike basis. If the sense of drama was there, and it was because we carried it in our own hearts, remembering that this meant liberation, freedom from suffering, and spared lives for countless thousands in tortured Europe.
Everyone had street parties, but in Durgan we had a party in the schoolroom. Everybody got together because we were 20 little cottages and all together, and we all had our little jobs to do for our party in the schoolroom. And the children, we were given the job of getting the decorations. We had to go up through Glendurgan Gardens and just raid the place. Mr. and Mrs. Fox, the owners, said, go and pick whatever you like. So when you think of the exotic plants we would have picked, that now if you saw a child picking them. But we raided the place for all these flowers and brought them back to Durban. And then we had to go around to all the cottages begging jam jars to put them in. And jam jars were in short supply because you'd make your own jam. You needed the jam jars to put the jam in. So again, they were quite precious. So we got the jam jars and arranged the flowers, and that was our part towards the party in the schoolroom.
On the night that peace was declared, the hotel was still operating. In fact, a number of guests had already retired to bed when somebody heard the news on the radio, and they all started to celebrate, and people came out of their rooms and came downstairs, and the champagne was open. No rationing that night, and there was a great party at the hotel. And Howard Spring, who's become a well-known writer about this area and who's included the hotel in some of his books, was understood to have lunched at the hotel that next day. And as he drove through Mawnan Smith, the bunting and the flags and the celebrations were already in full flow.
I was taken prisoner on the 20th of May 1940 at Amiens in northern France. We as first prisoners had a difficult time up until May 1941 because of the large amount taken in the Blitzkrieg. I eventually reached Poland, worked on a farm, caught scabies caused by lice, worked in a textile factory in Lodz, which was known as the Manchester of Poland. There I saw the Jewish ghetto, which was part of the town that had been barbed-wired off. You saw the young children there with the Star of Judah, the children, the older people, and from there they went to the concentration camp. On the 20th of January 1945, we were force-marched away from the Russian advance in very low temperatures. We advanced as far as the River Oder. There were several fellows that we had to leave behind that got frostbite. We got over the River Oder, up over the mountains into Czechoslovakia, across Czechoslovakia to Bavaria, and almost as far as Munich. Now, also what I saw on the march was, owing to the fact that we had been at a place called Gleiwitz, that was the last camp that I was in, which it was in Silesia really, That was next door to Auschwitz. And at different times, we had got caught amongst the inmates of Auschwitz, which were advancing as well away from the Russians. And one particular day, I actually saw 8 of the inmates shot in front of my own eyes. And a guard, which was an SS guard, said that he had disposed of 150 rounds of ammunition and he had no more left. After the column had gone through, the Germans in that village had to come and bury those people by the roadside. When eventually the Americans were making their advance and we were marched back towards Austria. There we were released by the Americans.
It's most important that we remember all that was done for us in the past, and we are probably the last breed now that will have got some contacts with the people that work like in the SOE operations in the river. I think as far as I know there's only one remaining survivor now. I might be wrong, but I think there's only one remaining survivor out of all those men that went across the Breton coast. We shall never know what they suffered and went through during the war, and we have got to be thankful for those.